You are listening to the Thinking Effect podcast with Ortal Green and LILI-ANN Kriegler.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 34 of the Thinking Effect podcast. Today, we're talking about how can teachers foster metacognition? And I'm not going to do that on my own. So I have the most wonderful guest for you today, and I'm going to say hello to Dr. Shyam Barr. Hello.
Hi, LILI-ANN. Thanks for having me.
It's so exciting to have you on our podcast, Dr. Shyam. We've been talking about it for a little while, and I cannot wait for you to share some of your really great information with our listeners today. All over the globe, you're going to find us really fascinating. Now, Dr. Shyam has recently become that doctor, but I'm going to ask him to introduce himself.
Thanks, LILI-ANN. Yes, so I guess on that note, I did complete my PhD early last year. So I had the lovely change in title about mid last year. But I currently work as an assistant professor of learning sciences at the University of Canberra and have been doing that for the last 3 years. So even before completing my PhD, which I've felt very blessed to be able to work in teacher education, specifically around the science of learning. Human learning and development are typically the suite of units that I teach. And alongside that, I also do a lot of work with schools, helping schools better understand self-regulated learning, and a core part of that being metacognition. So hopefully I'll be able to draw on that knowledge here today.
Absolutely. I mean, so metacognition can sometimes be a little bit obscure for people. So it's a little bit like getting inside your own head and watching your own brain working, isn't it? It's like really understanding the how of education rather than the what. So it's more about the process than the content of learning. And you and I met about 7 years ago when we were involved in a project at Independent Schools Victoria, which was called Cognizance. And it really was based on the idea that students improve their learning when they understand how their brain is working and what the brain is doing. But anyway, let me find out from you, what do you think? What is metacognition?
This is something that I have grappled with for some time, LILI-ANN. I think it's such an abstract concept that when I was in schools working as a full-time teacher, and I think if you ask a lot of teachers today, what is metacognition, the common response I hear and used to think myself is it's thinking about thinking. But over the last few years, particularly through my PhD research, I had to dig deeper into what that actually meant. And what I found was a pattern among definitions, which was more than just thinking about thinking. So it was more than just being aware of our thinking, more than just observing or noticing our thinking. But there's actually a key component of metacognition, which is kind of a control or regulation component. And so I really like Anne Brown's definition here, which is that metacognition is our knowledge and awareness of our cognition, our thinking, but it's also the second component, which is regulation or control of that cognition. And so that, I think, is a much better definition than thinking about thinking. And so when we think through that lens, that definition, we can actually ask ourselves, well, okay, how can I foster my students' awareness of their thinking? But also, what strategies can I teach them that allow them to change, to control, or to regulate that thinking, if and when they need to?
Yeah, so that's a step further, isn't it? Because, I mean, I can understand soccer maybe, but unless I actually play soccer and use the knowledge, it really doesn't help me to be a better soccer player. And similarly, if you know how you think, but you're not actually able to harness that thinking through the control that you're talking about, it does become really difficult to use it and to put it to work for you. And I know that you have some really good reasons as to why students need to perhaps self-regulate their learning and their thinking. So what is the reason why would teachers spend time learning and thinking about metacognition itself?
It has such an impact on so many levels here. And it's interesting that you asked me this question, LILI-ANN, because I'm currently in the midst of writing my TEDx Canberra talk that's coming up in a week and a half. And I've been thinking about what the best way to frame this is. And on one hand, I've been looking at the current kind of Australian Bureau of Statistics numbers of people that are changing their jobs right now at a global, sorry, not on a global level, at an Australian level. So in the last year alone, it was almost 3.4 million people that have either changed or lost their jobs and now have to reskill or upskill. Now, in that moment, what's going to be really important for those individuals is to think about what they need to achieve in their learning in terms of this reskilling, upskilling. To navigate that learning process, they're going to need to be aware of their own thinking and adjust their approach accordingly so that they actually can have success in their new careers potentially. And so I'm thinking that actually the reason we have to foster it now in students in schools is a much more future focused kind of impact. And so it's on one hand, it's great. We want our students to be able to regulate their attention, to shift their thinking for the sake of learning in a school setting. But on a much larger scale, it's about helping them be successful in the future, not just in their careers, but also in their relationships, whether that's as a parent, a husband, in my case, thinking about how we communicate. Being aware of what we're thinking and being able to change that thinking is absolutely powerful in then changing our behavior. And so it's a long-winded response, but it's much bigger than I think what we're doing in schools.
That's right. Well, congratulations, first of all, on getting up your TEDx talk, because I think many teachers aspire to such a great thing. So congratulations on that. But yet I love how you have projected this from the kind of here and now, to the future, because really, what is education for if it's not giving us a foundation or a platform for being successful in life? And what you're talking about sounds a little bit to me like developing a mindset that will accept that change is going to happen, no matter what. I mean, they say that probably the only certain thing in life is that there will be uncertainty and that change will happen. But it seems like you can help students at this stage, if they have an awareness of maybe what their habitual thinking is, to change that mindset and to understand their own power, to create the building blocks for, confronting change and understanding the world around them and mastering the world around them. So that is a fantastic reason that you would, want children to understand their own mind, and then also to harness some of these attention building components that you were calling self-regulation. Now, I mean, our teachers out there, the listeners, are probably thinking to themselves, how on earth are we going to help our students to develop this? Because it's quite a big step and it sounds quite complex. So what are some of the ways that teachers can, in their own classrooms with their own students, work on this sort of principle?
So, if we take the first component of metacognition, which is developing that awareness, one component of our mind that we can develop awareness around is where we're allocating attention. And that's really important for our young people today, even for us as adults, when there's so much information available through social media and online, and there's so many things that we can pay attention to. Being able to, or being aware of where our attention is being allocated is going to be really important. And then making decisions about where we do that or where we place our attention is going to be important as well. So one thing that I often share with teachers, and this is a strategy that they find very simple and easy to implement, is what is essentially just a post-it note tally strategy. And what that involves is giving your students I often just give them a post-it note, keep it really simple. You can make it more complex than this if you like. I give them that post-it note, and as part of a class discussion, we will have a conversation about what we deem as on-task behaviors and what we deem as off-task, and that's a co-constructed list. What we then do is I just get them throughout the lesson to think about when to catch themselves whenever they get distracted, to think about, are they on task or are they off task, and to make a little tally on their post-it notes. And so that could be as simple as drawing a line down the post-it note, on task, off task, and just making a little tally next to each of those about whenever they catch themselves off task, just pop a little tally on and give themselves the self-instruction, which is simply, okay, time for me to get back on task. It's as simple as that. We don't want to make that too complicated. Just, okay, I've caught myself. And the idea there is that every time we catch ourselves, we're building that kind of metaphorical kind of muscle, and we can get stronger and faster at catching ourselves in that moment. The better we get at catching ourselves, the more quicker we can make a choice about what we do.
Yes, what I think is good about that is that there's evidence. I think it's very, very difficult to make a tally in your own mind when you think, oh, I've done it once, I've done it twice, I've done it 3 times. So now they have this piece of paper which is external to themselves, but it's relating to, in time events, because each time you skip out on the attention, it's a metacognitive event. So they're writing down and telling as though it was a heartbeat or whatever it is. So there's genuine data or evidence that they can look at. And what have the students felt about this in your classes? I'm really fascinated.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I was digging up some of the old kind of reflections, and what I've done, and I've seen other teachers do this as well, is that at the end of the lesson, get the students together and have a discussion about what the students were seeing and noticing in terms of their own kind of tally. And it's so interesting to hear the diversity of responses. But one student, which I'd written down, and I thought I'll share it here, was that a Year 7 student said that the tally task was like a little accountability buddy. At times, when he felt bad, when he made a tally in the off task, he felt bad, but he knew that the buddy was there to help him. And it was so cute, this little statement around this tally task, this table being an accountability buddy. And I thought, oh, that's a really nice way to think about it. There's no actual external person here. It's just a post-it note. But how you can almost separate yourself from what you're doing and having this extra person, in some ways that is metacognition, isn't it? It's that observer, that accountability buddy. And so you can generate some really rich conversations with students in terms of their reflections and their awareness. There's an extension to this because I know that some students find it really challenging to catch themselves. And so there might be a need for a scaffold to help them get to a point where they can initially catch themselves. And that might be a peer or a teacher, or even a sound, like I saw one teacher use the beep strategy where they actually had a sound go off every sort of 5 minutes. And it was just in that 5-minute moment to think about what you're doing. Are you off task, on task? And so there's little ways you can almost scaffold this up if they're not ready for it just yet.
Again, yeah, so that's a sort of an external reminder. And I mean, that idea you mentioned earlier of this being like a muscle that we can practice and get better at, I think that's really a fun thing as well. And I just love the idea of this external accountability person who's just like a coach, come on, you can extend this time, you can do this many more push-ups or bicep curls or whatever. I actually did some, one of the great cognitive psychologists of humanity was Professor Reuven Feuerstein. And I used to give some support for students who were battling a little bit with things like self-regulation. And of course, I have 2 cats that run my house. They're in total control. And, I didn't want to banish them from the area because I felt it was a good thing to have them there, because if the child was getting distracted all the time, that's what they had to overcome. And I remember at one stage the child was about to turn to have a look at the cat, and it suddenly grabbed her head and said, no looking at the cat. And it's interesting. So that is just a real sense of self-awareness.
Yeah.
And another thing I used to do, and teachers might like this with younger children too, is I used to draw a road, just a dead straight road with a little side road to the left and a side road to the right. And then, if they attended for more than, say, 10 or 14 seconds, because some of these children have very, very low self attention, we'd say, you've gone off the main road. Or, oh my, now you stayed on the main road for, and then give them, again, a time component, which is like the data that you're talking about. It's a tally. And it's, again, one kind of an externalization for the children to have a look at, so that they get to understand that they can pause, that they can change direction, that they have that sort of power to do that.
And LILI-ANN, have I understood you correctly then, in what we're both talking about, that is a self-recording approach, which is in itself a metacognitive approach? So I often talk about different metacognitive strategies, and this one we're talking about here is when we're getting students to self-record something, in this case attention, that's going to develop awareness. And then, of course, you've got the added benefit of teaching them some self-instructions or self-talk statements that help them pivot that or change that.
I'd love you to expand on that, the self-talk, because I think it's very important. So please tell us a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So in this particular case, self-talk, or, self-talk can be a range of things. It's kind of a big umbrella, and underneath it, you could have self-instructions, you can have self-questions. These are essentially the types of things that we say to ourselves to help us move forward with our learning, to help us better understand, deepen our understanding of a particular concept, to regulate our attention, et cetera, et cetera. And so one example might be as simple as, okay, I need to get back on task. That could be happening just inside my head. No one can see it, but it is a statement that I'm saying to myself. It could be, what is it that I'm trying to learn here? Am I making progress? Am I feeling confident about my skills to do this? And if I'm not, even if it's the statement of I'm not feeling confident about this, what we want to teach them, if they've recognized that and they've said, okay, I've actually just said that to myself, what would a student need to say to themselves to move them past that? Okay, I recognize I'm not confident right now, but I know Mr. Barr told me that sometimes when I'm not feeling confident about something, that it's really good to reflect back on when I've had previous success in similar types of tasks. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. And so even in that moment of lacking self-efficacy, that confidence for a specific task, there is something the child can say to themselves that can move themselves forward. And so self-talk, like I said, it's a very big umbrella. But if we can explicitly teach some of those statements, that will help the child internalize some positive self-talk. I actually read a book. It was called In a Speech. It was a while ago. I can get the book title for you, LILI-ANN.
If you get it for me, what we'll do is we'll pop it in the description of the podcast, where we post it. There's a write-up and we can put that information in. I'm sure people will find it valuable.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, in that book, it's an academic book, so it's quite a deep read. But one thing I did remember reading in that book was that as children, we often publicize our talk. It's private speech, but it's not so private in the sense that we'll often vocalize what we're doing when we're doing it. And so as children, LILI-ANN, you're probably more aware of this than I am in terms of young children, I'm putting the teddy bear on the chair, they'll say things out loud. And at some point that speech becomes internal. And it's that internal speech becomes the self-talk. And we just want to make sure that we are still recognizing that as a component of metacognition and therefore self-regulated learning.
Yes, I mean, I really think that is quite crucial for learning. And the kinds of questions you were framing, I really thought those were great, because, you know, a lot of the time when teachers are asking questions at the end of the lesson, they might be very content related, like, what have you learned today? You know, tell me what order this should occur in, or what are the elements of this? And it's very content based, but what you're doing is you're bringing attention to how they feel about the task. And then it's more that, like, what do I have to find out? What do I have to plan? What do I have to you know, so it's much more about the process of learning. And I think the distinction between those two kinds of questioning, so that the students develop the kind of self-talk related to metacognition, and it can start very, very early. You know, we don't have to wait for children to get to primary or secondary to start asking the kinds of questions that help them to develop an understanding of their, what we suppose call their approach to learning, or their attitude to learning, or their habits of mind. You know, and a lot is written about that. But I think, you know, if you can, for every question you ask about content, if you can balance that with a question around process and just continue to make that awareness, then, you know, I think students become much more powerful at being able to determine their mindset and their framing of what their life is like. Because I think you sort of imply that sometimes they might make a mistake or do something wrong, but they can pick themselves up again and start from the beginning and try again, rather than just failing and accepting it. So, you know, those sorts of questions around process are beautiful. And then, as you know, what you've mentioned for us is that they relate to the kind of self-talk where not only are they I suppose managing their attention, but they're also managing how they're going to frame the things that are happening to them in life, which is really an advanced skill, isn't it?
And that's the skill set I think is most valuable to them, well beyond the bounds of a school, isn't it?
Yes. And if you transfer that into your life, that can be just amazing.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to add to this? It's just such a fascinating topic, Shyam.
I will. I think there's a nuanced difference between the way when we think about a question like, how do you feel about this particular task, or, you know, how did you feel about your learning during this activity? I can frame that as a teacher where I'm the individual asking them the question and getting the students to reflect in that moment. And that's important. And I think a lot of teachers do that and do that quite well. We ask these reflective questions and prompt student reflection. What we want to do as educators is start to shift those questions from us as teachers being the ones that are asking those questions to the student asking themselves those questions. And that's really when we start tapping into metacognition, and that component of it being a self-talk or a self-question is that the student starts to ask themselves, how do I feel about this task, without the teacher being that prompt? And, you know, and so that's the shift we want to achieve. And there has to be, there's a difference between me asking it and me teaching it as a strategy for them to then use in the future. And I think that's something worthwhile. Hopefully the listeners might ponder that and think, how can I shift that? Because that's going to be really important.
Yeah, that's a great shift. It really is quite significant, because, you know, we can ask the questions, but really when they are asking the questions deep within their own selves, that is when they can drive, you know, their progress or their thinking or their attitudes to life. You know, Professor Ruben Feuerstein always used to say that no matter what you teach, you have to have intentionality, clearly,
Yes.
but you have to get the reciprocity from the students. But the next thing he said was that there has to be a real meaning. And it wasn't like, what is the meaning of this content? It was more like, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this? Why would I bother? Why would I expend energy? Why am I motivated to do this? So we can help them generate that purpose, you know, and give them reasons why. But, in genuine self-regulation, those students would be able to perhaps generate the purpose for themselves, even beyond that, to say, look, I'm not enjoying this at the moment, but, I'm training my mind in some way, because, whatever I'm using to learn this, I'm sure I can use it somewhere else, or frame it for themselves in some completely different way. Maybe they promise themselves they're going to have chocolate cake when they get home if they get through this, or whatever it is, but they are able to get through difficulties and tasks which are a bit challenging, giving themselves a sense of purpose around it. And I really love that shift from us deciding, or offering them a purpose, versus them generating that purpose and being motivated, intrinsically motivated themselves to do that. I mean, and a lot of this really is around the kind of culture which you as a teacher are creating in your classroom. And I think, you have to have a very safe kind of environment where everybody feels comfortable. And then you also want this kind of metacognitive aspect to everything that's going on.
I think it's easy for some teachers I like to talk to find this quite challenging because they feel like it's additional work for them. But I actually don't think it's extra work. It is. I've used the word pivot multiple times today, but I think pivot's probably a nice word in that it's not about working harder. It's actually just about working a little bit differently. And it's just about where we place, as teachers, where we allocate our attention, where we place that attention in terms of the focus of the lesson. Is it on the content? Is it on metacognition? Is it on learning as a process? And so it's just that small pivot that will actually bring about some big results for our young people.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Shyam, what we usually do is a little bit of a summary at the end. So you can add to this at the end. So metacognition, what is it? It is beyond thinking about our thinking. It really is framing our attitudes and habits around life and our perspectives, and how much of ourselves and our motivation we're going to bring into our life's success. Why is that it's going to change the trajectory of our lives if we are able to do that, because we will understand ourselves better, and we'll probably discover more about ourselves as we go through our life's journey. So whether this is a journey that happens within just one lesson in the classroom, or whether it's like, your whole life trajectory, it really is important to understand how the process of thinking is impacting on our lives. And then some of the ways that you brought up that we can do it is to have this tallying, the kind of self-recording, and then also making the students aware of how they are giving themselves direction through their own inner voice, their own self-talk, because that has a really great impact on how they're learning. And then, just yourself as an educator, and I love what that word you used, and I know you've used it a few times today, we'll use it again, is to pivot between the content learning and the process learning, and understanding what kind of influencers we are really every day in the classroom in terms of not only building content knowledge, but self-knowledge in this way. So really that's what, the potential is of working with metacognition in the classroom.
Beautifully summarized, LILI-ANN.
Oh, thank you so much. You know what? I got it all from you. I want to thank you so much for taking time to spend with us today, and wish you the greatest luck with whatever it is that you've got coming up. I'm delighted you're out there in schools bringing this knowledge and shining the light on both knowledge, but also I think on optimism. I think, a lot of the time what we need to work on is optimism for the future. And this is really one of the ways that we can build that. So thank you so much.
Thanks, LILI-ANN. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I know we've mentioned the TEDx talk. It's coming up on the 16th of October. And while I assume many of the listeners won't be able to attend, there will be a video available. And I'd love, if people are interested, I'll be talking about metacognition and the importance of fostering kind of a learning identity in schools. And
absolutely wonderful. If you can send me a link,
happy to.
I will put it again in the information about this podcast. So even if people have got to the end of the podcast, they can go back and read up the write-up, and then they can come in and listen. And I think once again, they'll be very, very excited to hear what you have to say. And really, we love hearing from educators. So if you are using a metacognition, if you have any ideas for how students can externalize, track, data track, understand their own learning and their own perspectives, please write to us at thethinkingeffectpodcast@gmail.com.